Hello and welcome. I'm Charlie Oppler, 2021 President of the National Association of Realtors. I'm thankful to have so much brain power here today representing policymaking, academia, the media, and real estate. Because it will take all of us and many other stakeholders to solve our once-in-a-generation housing shortage. There's a four-letter word I don't use often because it should be used judiciously, but I'm going to use it today. That word is dire. The U.S. housing shortage is enormous. It's the result of more than a decade of severe underbuilding and underinvestment. This crisis is driving extreme price increases, which are sidelining more and more low and moderate income households. It also has increased home maintenance costs as existing housing stock ages. Even now, as the pace of home building has picked up, it's far, far short of where it needs to be. Reaching the necessary volume will require a major long-term national commitment. Building all types of new housing must be an integral part of any national infrastructure plan. Like roads and bridges, affordable and available housing is an essential long-term asset that helps families climb the economic ladder to prosperity, brings folks closer to work and job opportunities, and generates tax revenue that in turn supports community residents. So what are we going to do about this crisis? The National Association of Realtors is urging action at the federal and local levels on a variety of specific proposals informed by our robust research. The author of that research will discuss our report, Housing is Critical Infrastructure, Social and Economic Benefits of Building More Housing shortly. I'm glad to share that new report is receiving a lot of attention. In fact, the Biden administration's Director of National Economic Council, Brian Deese, recently retweeted the information from the report. In addition to federal advocacy, our state and local realtor associations are actively leading governmental and other agencies to implement solutions, including many described in this new report. You'll meet several of these association experts today. Our moderators are NAR's Vice President of Policy Advocacy, Brian Green, who will lead a panel of policy experts discussing strategies to tackle the underbuilding gap. And Asa Fleming, NAR's Realtor Party Community Engagement Liaison, who will moderate our state panel. Besides being a realtor, Asa is Vice Chair of the Wake County Planning Commission in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is one of the highest growth counties in the country. Asa lives and breathes planning and zoning issues. He's a past president of the North Carolina Association of Realtors. His panelists will share their strategies to increase residential construction. But first, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, David Bank, Senior Vice President at the Rosen Consulting Group and author of our Housing is Critical Infrastructure report. Mr. Bank previously served as an economist for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where he authored housing market reports for the Office of Policy Development and Research. Prior to that, he worked as a consultant in the market research and healthcare industries. Mr. Bank received a master's in international development economics from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a bachelor's in economics from New York University. Please welcome David Bank.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm excited to be here this afternoon to talk about our research that we've done at Rosen Consulting on our most recent paper that we've titled Housing is Critical Infrastructure, Social and Economic Benefits of Building More Housing. The, the goal of our paper is to try and highlight the importance of housing, and in particular the supply shortages and the need to build more housing as part of the strategy around our national infrastructure and thinking about how to build our infrastructure for the 21st century. The research that we have done really tries to look at thinking about supply as key to tackling our chronic shortage of affordable and available homes in this country. And in particular, as we do that, we look through the way that we've built housing, looking back over the past couple decades and compared to our long-term history, to try and think about how we've underbuilt housing compared to our long-term trend. And I'll get into that a little bit more as I go through the presentation, but we really want to emphasize the size and scale of the problem, the negative consequences of underinvesting and underbuilding housing, the potential benefits if we were to tackle housing construction and building more housing in a large-scale, serious way as part of an infrastructure solution, and ultimately the need to think of that as a problem that has such a large scale that it requires an all-of-the-above strategy and a coordinated approach, an infrastructure approach. Ultimately, when we think about housing and we think about it in the context of infrastructure, the idea is that critical infrastructure is a term that refers to the physical assets and the systems that we need to keep our country and our communities safe and vibrant. And when you think about it in that respect, it's hard to think of a physical asset that's more critical to our success and vibrancy of our communities than access to decent, safe, and affordable housing. And so, we see housing as an important part of infrastructure for that reason. The other piece that is critical is the scale of the problem. I'll get into that in a second. And lastly, we really want to emphasize the importance of thinking about housing as part of other types of infrastructure as a holistic approach, and the ability to accomplish so much more by thinking about infrastructure of all types together in terms of how they influence our communities and how they influence the people that ultimately need access to housing. So with that, I want to start with thinking about how we looked at the question of underbuilding. And in our report, we do this in a few different ways. The first that I want to spotlight here is the concept of underbuilding of housing supply compared to our long-term trend. So basically what we were looking at here is total housing construction, including single-family and multifamily housing. And over the very long term, from the late 1960s through until 2000, we built approximately 1.5 million housing units per year. And the housing construction slowed dramatically following the last downturn, the Great Recession, and really never recovered to levels that we've seen over the long-term history. And when we look at the magnitude of that gap and how it accrued over the last couple decades, even when you include the early 2000s period when construction was pretty strong, we end up with a cumulative deficit of more than 5.5 million housing units compared to our long-term historical trend. So an enormous gap relative to historical supply. Importantly, that gap's not just in total, but it's also across types of buildings. And we estimated more than 2 million housing unit gap in terms of single family homes relative to long-term construction, and very significant gaps in both small 2 to 4 unit multifamily product, as well as larger 5 or more unit apartment and condo buildings. The gap also extends across all regions of the country, not just areas where demographic growth has slowed and therefore construction has slowed, but also includes particularly the South and West. And this chart here looks at the annual gaps, which really are very significant. And ultimately, it highlights, and we get into some of the metro area data in the paper, but it highlights the extent to which our underbuilding gaps are not just certain areas, not just coastal, but really extend across from coast to coast, cities large and small, urban communities, suburban communities, and really a wide range of different areas. So that was looking just relative to historical supply. We also looked at this in a different way that focused on housing demand relative to supply. And here we're looking at just the past decade. What we did here is we looked at housing demand, including both household formation, which is a measure of new residents occupying either rental or owner housing, so people going out and renting or buying a home. And then we also added in the loss of existing stock. So that would be housing units that are demolished or that are, reach an age where they're no longer habitable, as well as units that are destroyed from natural disasters. When you look at the combination of building housing to meet the demand from new household formation, plus replacing existing stock that's lost, we really have a very large gap each year, and a total of approximately 6.8 million housing unit gap compared to demand over the last decade. So very significant. Through our paper, we really focused heavily on the more conservative of those two estimates, which is the 5.5 million housing units. Of course, there's a wide range of potential estimates, but the important takeaway that we've tried to highlight in this table here is that even if we could get back to our historical norm of building 1.5 million housing units per year, we would still need to dramatically increase the amount of construction that we build every year in order to close the gap over a period of even 10 to 20 years. In fact, over 10 years, we're talking about more than 500,000 additional housing units over and above our historical trend. And alternatively, if we just go with a sort of status quo approach of building at the pace that we have recently, at least through the spring where housing construction really accelerated, that would still take almost 20 years to fill the gap of 5.5 million housing units without changing the way we approach building housing construction, without a fundamental shift in the size and the scale of our investment in new housing. So beyond the scale of the problem and the nature of the underbuilding, we looked at a range of negative consequences, and we get into several of these during the paper. First, I want to highlight, just from a very macroeconomic perspective, from the largest, broadest viewpoint, over the very long term, we've spent about 5% of our national GDP, the total economic activity in the country, on residential fixed investment, which is a concept that includes both new housing construction and also housing renovation. And if we had continued building at that 5% pace throughout the last 2 decades, we would have had much more investment in housing than we actually did when we look at the blue bars here that highlight the actual investment. In fact, when you look at the cumulative gap, even including the strong construction in the early 2000s, it's a gap of more than $4 trillion in economic activity that we really should have spent on residential investment over the 2-decade period, but didn't. So there's a large sort of economic impact that could be achieved, or that was rather lost, by not investing in housing. The second thing I want to highlight is household formation. Over the last decade, 2 decades, in fact, we've seen a huge spike in the number of young adults living at home, those 25 to 34, living with parents. So essentially, these are potential households, people many of whom would like to go out and rent their first apartment or possibly buy their first home, but are unable to do so for a range of reasons that include student loans and other cost of living, but certainly include affordability challenges on the housing side. So we're limiting household formation, we're limiting the growth of housing demand because of the shortage of available and affordable homes. We've seen a dramatic aging of the housing stock. I mentioned the need to build housing to replace the losses of existing housing stock. Well, the lack of building and the lack of investment in housing construction in the last 2 decades has dramatically shifted the structure of our housing stock. Looking back 20 years ago, about a third of our housing was at least 40 years old in the country. Today, that's more than half of all the housing in the country is at least 40 years old. On the other side of that, we've got just barely 7% of housing in the country that was built in the last 10 years as of 2019. So what we've seen is a dramatic aging of housing, and this means older housing that requires more investment to maintain and increases the losses of housing units over time in terms of housing that is functionally available and decent and safe for people to live in. The next piece I want to highlight as a negative consequence is the unsustainable strain on the for sale housing market. Now, this is a topic that obviously has gotten a lot of attention and is particularly problematic in terms of the low inventory of homes available for sale. That's created a great deal of competition and very, very significant price increases over the past year and a half. And the important thing that I want to highlight here is that this is not just a pandemic-related impact, though that, of course, made the inventory of homes, both demand for housing and supply of housing, more that balance more severe. But this has also been trending down for the past decade and really never recovered after the last recession. So we've really had a shortage of homes available for sale for quite some time, and it's just been exacerbated over the last year. And of course, we face a very, very significant housing affordability crisis across the country. And it again predates the pandemic and recent recession, but rather goes back for a long period of time. When we look back over a 20-year period, the median home price in this country grew by almost 3 times the pace of the median household income. So we've seen a disconnect between incomes and housing costs for a long period of time, and a lot of that is heavily influenced by the supply shortage and the lack of available homes. And that's not just national, it extends across states. If we look back in 2012, which was a period several years after the last downturn, a period of recovery, when we actually had a relatively high level of affordability in many states where we had 65 or even 75% of households in that state able to afford the cost of owning the median priced home in their state. We fast forward to 2019, intentionally looking before the price surges during the pandemic, we see a very different picture across the country, with many more states in the orange and red colors here with a lot fewer households able to afford home ownership. So, that's been focused on the negatives of underinvesting. I want to kind of flip to, what's the positive here? What's the outlook if we could dramatically think about housing and housing construction in a new way, making a sort of new investment in how we build housing for the next century? And there really are a wide range of potential economic benefits from building more housing, especially if we do it at a larger scale. It's not just the direct employment or the new construction jobs that we would get if we built more single family or multifamily housing, but it's a broad range of employment that extends both across the supply chain, but also has a large multiplier effect as the income generated from one job creates new spending and ultimately becomes the income for others and drives and supports new jobs in other industries. And when we think about it, there's really a very broad range of potential economic benefits, significant positives in terms of consumer spending, and ultimately a lot of potential federal tax revenue. So we looked at this in our paper and we said, well, what if we tried to make that aggressive goal of saying, how do we fill this gap of 5.5 million housing units in the next 10 years, building 550,000 homes over and above the long-term average? Well, that's a very aggressive goal, but if we could achieve it, we also would have very significant economic activity in terms of the potential growth in our economy around the country. We estimate that would support almost 3 million new jobs and more than $400 billion in economic activity each year, and more than $50 billion in new tax revenue, including federal, state, and local sources. So very significant if we could make this kind of investment. There's a lot of potential benefits. It's also not just the kind of more straightforward economic benefits. There's also a lot of potential for social and community benefits that could be achieved, and really, in many ways, seriously tackling our affordability crisis can only be done through dramatically increasing the pace of new home construction. If we could do that in a way that is sufficient in scale to tackle our affordability issues, bring home prices and the cost of owning a home more in line with incomes, there's a lot that can do. There's a lot of potential for improving labor market mobility, which means that people can go to the markets where they have jobs and be able to find affordable homes. There's improvements in terms of financial stability for individual households, giving people greater ability to pay for college, pay for healthcare and childcare, and to save for a down payment on a home. So there really is a wide range of benefits here that could be achieved by tackling this from a broad national approach and really kind of taking a large-scale approach to new home construction. When we start to think about how we would actually do this, I want to emphasize a few things. The first, and the paper gets into this in a lot more detail, is the concept of building housing as infrastructure for inclusive communities. What we do in the paper is we look at a number of different ways where we can think about the lessons from how we built housing in the how we built infrastructure, in the 20th century, and how to think about that going forward. And the paper looks at a number of examples and specifically highlights examples in Syracuse and in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but you could find examples from all around the country of ways that infrastructure, especially highway construction, but extends beyond highways, that was built in the 20th century, was done in a way that that really harmed many communities by not thinking about the full impacts, by through a variety of different reasons and causes, but ultimately ended up with a situation where there were many communities around the country that ended up with these pockets of hyper segregation and pockets of hyper concentrations of poverty. We focused on this quite a bit in the paper, because what we want to focus on is that when you think about building infrastructure for the 21st century, it's really an opportunity to do it in a different way. If we think about infrastructure from a holistic or community-centric approach, it becomes much easier to start thinking about the fact that we can't build one form of infrastructure without thinking about the impacts on others. To be more specific, if we're going to build new highways or new bridges or new broadband internet, we need to think about who are the communities, who are the people that are going to be using those services, where are they going to live, how are they going to be able to afford the housing, and how we're going to be able to make sure that there's enough housing for them to live and ultimately benefit from those other forms of infrastructure. And it's for that reason that we think it's so important to have a coordinated approach to housing construction as part of an infrastructure strategy. Lastly, I want to focus on 5 other areas that we look at when we think about the need for a once-in-a-generation response and the need for tackling this large-scale problem. First of all, it's important to think of, if we're going to tackle a problem of this scale, whether you think of it as 5.5 million housing units, closer to 7 million housing units, the approach either way, it requires a recognition that we can't just continue with a status quo, that we actually need a lot more housing of all types. We need an all of the above strategy. No single type of housing construction, no single effort is going to help fill that gap, sufficiently. So what we need is a combination. We need affordable and we need market rate housing. We need urban and suburban housing. We need a mix and a full spectrum of costs. And we need both for sale housing and rental housing across a range. And the only way we're really going to achieve that, and we're going to achieve that in a large scale, is through a national commitment to building more housing and to doing it in a large scale, serious way. So the paper gets into quite a bit of additional detail on policy goals of how to accomplish that. I'm going to kind of briefly highlight a few of them here. The first is thinking about maximizing the resources that we have available by expanding the size and scope of existing programs. And there are many here, but particularly I want to mention the low-income housing tax credit program, which has been the dominant source of building affordable housing around the country for decades, using federal tax credits to support private investment. And there's a lot of opportunity there to take that concept and expand it both in terms of size and scope. We're going to try and dramatically increase the amount of housing construction that we do. The second piece is looking at ways to incentivize changes in state and local zoning and regulatory requirements. These are things that influence the time and cost it takes to build new housing. They're also things that limit the density and the locations where we can build housing. And if we're going to try and build much more housing in a truly large scale, we have to find ways to tackle this, whether it be through grants that support communities that make these changes, or through other approaches such as contingent funding, or again, using tax credit methods such as there have been ideas proposed around zoning improvement tax credits that could be used to help fund these sort of changes. The next thing I want to highlight is conversion of commercial space to residential. This is particularly timely today. There are large segments of the commercial real estate industry that have been hit very, very hard by the pandemic. And we have high levels of vacancy in retail, hotel, office product around the country. And to different degrees and over time, those will certainly come back as we reopen from the pandemic. But we also have an opportunity to say, well, we've got a lack of housing. We've got underutilized commercial space, including some space that far predated the pandemic, especially on the retail side. And through using federal tax credits to incentivize conversions, we could make it easier and more cost-effective to convert these to residential housing. So really a potential win-win, building more housing and helping to alleviate some of the challenges in the hardest hit segments of the commercial real estate industry. The last two things I want to focus on are expanding capacity for residential construction. As of today, we have labor market shortages, we have supply chain issues, we have rising material costs. These are all very real challenges that make it difficult to build housing faster than we are today, and certainly difficult to try and achieve the scale of building we need to close that housing gap. But they're all also things that could be tackled, and we get into some of the strategies here in the paper, that could be tackled as part of the national commitment to saying, you know, if we're going to build more housing, then we need to make sure that we have the labor, that we have the materials, and that we have the technology needed to do that. And lastly, you know, I've highlighted already the need for building housing as part of infrastructure for inclusive communities. And the idea here is really to focus on a coordinated approach, to thinking about planning, funding, and development for all forms of infrastructure together, to thinking about the need to put communities first, and ultimately to recognizing the fact that, you know, if we build, if we spend money on other forms of infrastructure, if we build highways without thinking about who the communities are and how they'll be able to, people will be able to afford to live in areas where they can benefit from those highways, then at best we're not getting the full measure of our investment. But we're also losing an opportunity to build housing in a new and better way, and to build infrastructure in a new and better way for the 21st century. So with that, you know, I'll wrap up here today. I look forward to hearing the panel discussions, and I just want to mention that, you know, the full report that we've written on housing and the need to treat it as critical infrastructure is available on NAR's website. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Brian Green. I'm the Vice President for Policy Advocacy at the National Association of Realtors. First, I want to thank David. Thank you for that overview of the study that the Rosen Consulting Group did. This report on housing supply has been getting attention all throughout Washington. I'm pleased that Brian Deese, the head of the National Economic Council at the White House, tweeted out about this. So people all over Washington and all over the country are recognizing that housing supply is a dire need right now. And I want to talk to someone who would, I would expect, know this quite intimately. We're going to hear now from Elena McCargo, who is the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Elena joined HUD this year, coming from the Urban Institute, where she was the Vice President for the Housing Finance Policy Center. And she's no stranger to NAR. We've had Elena speak at past policy forums. In fact, Elena and I together spoke on a panel at a past housing policy forum. So Elena, it's great to welcome you back to NAR to talk about this very important subject. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, and I appreciate you guys inviting me. And this is obviously a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about, so I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, great. Well, when you were at Urban, you provided great advice to the housing industry and government on how to address these issues. Now you are in the hot seat at HUD, where you advise the Secretary of HUD directly on how we can address some of these issues. And the issue we're here to talk about today is housing supply. So I guess my first question is, what do you think? Is this the big issue that NAR has made it out to be? And what do you think should be done?
Well, it is the biggest issue in housing, I believe, is this housing supply crisis. And so absolutely, yes, you have not made a bigger deal of it than it is. It really has been and continues to be significant, especially affordable housing supply. We have been, you know, dealing with this for a long time. So even since 2009, you know, my colleagues at the Urban Institute in 2016, we've been sort of sounding the alarm about this issue. And since 2009, housing demand has significantly outstripped supply. Construction has not kept pace with demand. And you know, and really any surplus that we had in the market, even after the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, has you know been eliminated. Vacancy rates are incredibly low. So there's so much pressure on housing supply that we're seeing, this increasing affordability crisis as well that goes hand in hand with that. So just, I mean, that's how I would characterize the state of things right now. And I mean, we are long past, the need for some significant investments, policy, and focus on how we address that. And so it is sort of the housing issue of our time.
Yeah, and obviously with housing being a significant part of the economy, it really affects the future of this country, I would say. And our report, or I should say the Rosen Consulting Group's report for NAR, stressed that we're at least a decade behind, a decade to 20 years behind in terms of housing supply, the housing supply that we need. What are your thoughts on how we jumpstart this? I mean, obviously, there are probably longer term solutions, but do you want to highlight any short-term versus long-term solutions to set this right?
Well, I think, yes, I would love to talk about this. I think that there are not really silver bullets. We've got a whole process for new construction that we know has really seen significant increases in costs over the years along a number of dimensions of that process. I do want to tie what I think about as sort of possible solutions. I hate to say short term because I just don't feel like anything's super short term, but we can, I think we can look at this thing across a spectrum of things that may be able to get going faster, a little bit faster than your typical, new construction process and projects. So, I think really taking a serious look at how we accelerate renovation and rehabilitation construction projects, looking at anything, particularly coming out of this pandemic, that is maybe currently zoned as larger retail or commercial, and how that may be able to be transformed into affordable housing supply. Looking at things that are existing, we know that our country's housing supply is aging. I think on average, houses are 45 years old in this country. I mean, we've got significant housing infrastructure that is old and aging and that needs to be repaired. So I think really, getting on track with sort of a real aggressive renovation rehab process, and also building resiliency into that, energy efficiency for the future, are going to be really key things and approaches that we could be looking at. I do think really, again, just figuring out how the factory-built housing process, manufactured housing, and other approaches, we hear about accessory dwelling units and other innovations in housing that are not your typical longer-term construction process, and how we get more of that online is another area to really look at and see how we can accelerate more manufacturing centers and locations across the country to really get those out the door more. And I have to talk about these things and also say, we have to look at policy as well, local zoning and land use, how you turn larger buildings or commercial buildings into single family home sites into multifamily. Those are other kind of issues that have to be worked on hand in hand with the actual construction or renovation rehab work that needs to be done on America's housing inventory. The final thing I'll say, and this is probably more in the long-term bucket, is to think about this, multifamily, small multifamily housing. And again, I just want to mention, there's a lot of places now that are looking at really large single-family home sites. How do you maybe transition some of those into multifamily? But even the construction of 2 to 4 family housing, the construction of that type of housing has really fallen off. It used to be an incredible source of affordable housing supply, often with a homeowner living in one unit, renting out to other members of their family. We could really, that housing supply, that housing stock is very old and aging. So again, more work into sort of renovating and retrofitting that, but also building and constructing new multifamily units that aren't necessarily being built right now for both ownership and also for rental housing supply could go a long way.
So, NAR has often advocated that we can drive some of this policy through tax policy. We've been planting that seed with Department of Treasury on the Hill. For example, we've said, hey, you've got a lot of houses that became rental property after the last recession that perhaps we could reintroduce to the sale market for homeowners through capital gains tax cuts, or we could incentivize some of these conversions of existing commercial property to residential through tax cuts. Is the administration considering these kinds of approaches in the mix of possible solutions?
Sure. So I'll point to the president's initial infrastructure proposal, which had a significant, we call it the American Jobs Plan. And the plan has had a significant component that really does carve out the fact that we believe housing is infrastructure and a critical part of our nation's infrastructure. And that we, and part of that included not only ideas for how to invigorate programs like the home program here at HUD, which would enable and it works in tandem with the low-income housing tax credit programs to really help enable and boost the construction of new affordable supply. But there were several tax credit proposals that were part of that as well. So LIHTC investment was part of that, but also the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act was another piece that was suggested as a way to spur more affordable housing supply activity by really kind of advancing. It's kind of the LIHTC for single family housing and really looking at distressed neighborhoods, especially coming out of this pandemic as we move into these next phases. I think it's really important that we do consider those types of tax credit proposals and tax policy levers as opportunities. And I think they go in tandem and complement a lot of the housing policy levers that we have. A lot of this work that's done and the development that can be done in the affordable housing space requires both. Those tax incentives that are out there, but also again, programs like the CDBG block grant program and the Home Investment Partnership Program, those dollars that flow through grantees and into communities and cities all across the country that HUD provides are critical in order to make these affordable housing investments and to create and build and sustain housing supply.
I know our tax policy folks at NAR have also said you could possibly drive communities to consider more areas for duplex development too through tax credits as well, like tax credit bonds and things. So that's great to hear. What about challenges? What do you see as the major challenges? Because like a lot of great ideas out here. What are the great challenges in starting this? Because it seems as if there's pretty broad consensus that we have a housing supply shortage. What's it going to take to get some of these ideas off the ground?
Yeah, there are a lot of great ideas out here. And I think the first thing we need is, and we have, is leadership, a president and a housing secretary who are prioritizing this and understanding and acknowledging the issue. So I do think, will is half the battle, Brian, and you know that as well. This is, like I said, this is not a new problem. So we've been grappling with this as a country for quite some time. So the will is here, and now I do think that the real work for various stakeholders to come together to really move. This is not just something that can be solved by the federal government. It will require a lot of cooperation and work in tandem with state and local government, but also, the key stakeholders on the ground, the nonprofits, the developers, the construction industry and home builders, everybody sort of working towards a plan together that also requires investment. And so we really need to get some of this important infrastructure investment made and passed by the Congress. So a lot of pieces need to come together, and those obstacles that we face are huge. I'll just use one of the state and local examples that we always talk about, but I just think it's so important because it is critical to all of this work, and really has a lot to do with the costs of things and everything that we need to do to solve for this. But that's zoning. Zoning reform is a huge obstacle in a lot of places. Jurisdictions have to get serious about removing the legacy exclusionary zoning practices that get in the way of being able to start new developments and new construction projects that get in the way of your ability to do that kind of transformation from retail to residential in places that have a lot of empty and vacant older retail properties or commercial properties that get in the way of the kinds of homes you can put on site, whether that's manufactured housing or accessory dwelling unit building. So all of those things are huge, and those are really controlled at the local level. And if we could remove some of those barriers that would allow for more affordable housing to be built up or brought in different ways, that would be a huge obstacle that we would be getting through. A lot of what I just talked about also is incredibly costly. We have to rationalize the costs. Construction is expensive even before foundation is broken. I mean, just the cost for all the things you have to get in place before you can start a development is incredible, what that takes. And there's lots of research and data out there on that. But we have to figure out how to rationalize costs, what role can philanthropy and other parts of the process play in really helping to rationalize, subsidize, and help in the investment of and building of new affordable housing units. So all of those things, again, hopefully with energy efficiency, resiliency, and all the things we have ahead of us in terms of climate in mind, I think are huge obstacles and opportunities that we face right now.
Well, thank you, Elena. And I'm pleased that someone with your background and expertise is working on this. We feel privileged to have you speak with us today. You talked about state and local government. We're going to hear from state and local government today too. So we're really eager to hear what solutions they're considering, there. So thank you. We look forward at NAR to continue to work with the administration on solving this stubborn problem. So thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's great to see you.
Now I'm joined by Dennis Shea, who's a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and focusing on housing. And it's great to see you, Dennis.
Great to see you too, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. So, Dennis has had a fantastic career. Most recently, he served as the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative and as the U.S. Ambassador to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. I know Dennis from his work at HUD, where he was the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. Fantastic career. He actually pretty much cleaned Harvard out of degrees, did a hat trick there, earning his bachelor's, master's, and law degree there. And he has a great career as a lawyer as well. It's great to have you here, Dennis, to talk to us about housing supply. Let me ask you, we have at NAR emphasized the dire housing need. We believe we are a decade or more behind in creating housing in the United States, and it's having a great effect on affordability. What's your assessment of this issue?
Well, Brian, again, thanks for having me, and it's great to see you, even though virtually. 8 years ago, I worked with the BPC's Housing Commission on a report outlining a comprehensive national housing strategy. And in that report, we used words like urgent, crisis, unsustainable to describe the housing situation back then. particularly the affordability challenges. And unfortunately, you fast forward 8.5 years later, I think the situation has gotten worse. Millions of American families pay unsustainable rents, many paying in excess of 50% of their monthly income on rent, just on rent. Millions of families seeking to buy a home for the first time are now shut out of the home ownership market because they cannot find an affordable home where they want to live. And so I think the National Association of Realtors is absolutely correct that a major, if not the major cause of this affordability challenge is this acute shortage of affordable homes. And I think, you mentioned, Brian, the report that you recently released. And I think there's one statistic from that report that should be seared in everyone's memory, and that is that we have a underbuilt gap of 5.5 million homes over the past 20 years. I mean, when I saw that when it first came out, that really caught my attention, and that seems to be the crux of the matter. And this is not just a problem, this affordability challenge and the lack of supply, affordable supply. It's not just a problem in the big cities across America or along the two coasts. I mean, it's a urban problem, it's a rural problem, it's a blue state problem, and it's a red state problem. And I was just reading Harvard's, you mentioned Harvard, I was just reading their State of the Nation housing report recently, and they said over the past year, home prices have risen 28.2% in Boise, 22.7% in Austin, Texas, 21.6% in Tacoma. This is just over the past year. That's astounding. Those are astounding figures. And, and the situation, of course, has been exacerbated by the, economic dislocation caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, I think one of the enduring lessons of the pandemic is how fundamental housing is to all of us. I mean, we retreated to our homes to be safe, right? And then for millions of us, our home became our full-time place of work. And I suspect going forward in the post-pandemic world, millions of Americans will just work at home, at least full-time or part-time. So as we're having this changing notion of work centered around the home, we're having this immense affordability challenge to buying a home, to renting a home. So it's really a difficult situation.
So you point out that you were writing about this long ago, and there's no shortage of people talking about it now. We'd like to think that Harvard echoed our report because their report came out right after.
I'm sure they did, Brian.
They usually catch on. So what can we do now? We're so far behind. Can we jumpstart this? Is it a long-term solution? What do you recommend?
Well, for now, I'll just say there are fortunately some bipartisan solutions, on the table. I was looking at President Biden's infrastructure package, the housing elements. Now, there's a question of whether you do housing in the infrastructure package or not. But if you look at each of those elements that he has listed in the package, there's strong bipartisan support for them, each one. So, for example, the low-income housing tax credit. There is legislation in Congress calling for a significant expansion of the housing credit, which has done a good job over the past 30 or so years, incentivizing private capital to invest in affordable rental homes, in the rehabilitation and new construction. And that program was created by George Mitchell, a Democrat, and Jack Danforth, a Republican. And Republicans today support the low-income house, support the housing credit. So I think number one is let's expand the housing credit and let's make it maybe less complex and easier to utilize. So that's number one. Number two, a more recent initiative is this Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which seeks to incentivize private capital to build and renovate homes for first-time home buyers, and to address the appraisal gap, which has in many low-income neighborhoods, which has prevented the development of single-family housing. And this legislation, if enacted, is predicted could lead to about 500,000 new homes for middle-income and lower-income people, first-time home buyers, 500,000 new homes over the next 10 years. And there are Republicans who are strong supporters of that. People like Senator Todd Young of Indiana, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. There's also bipartisan consensus around the need to reinvest in our diminishing stock of public housing. And Republicans and Democrats have supported the rental assistance demonstration, which tries to leverage private capital to come in and support affordable, rental housing. And if we make all these investments, it's important to realize they have a ripple effect, throughout the economy. They can create more jobs, more revenue for local businesses, more tax receipts for various levels of government that could be used for essential services. There's also the issue of regulatory reform, which is basically more of a state or local county issue. President Biden has a competitive grant program at the federal level to sort of a carrot approach to encourage localities to get rid of unnecessary regulations that may act as a barrier to the development of affordable housing, excessive permitting, minimum lot sizes, density requirements. Whether it's a carrot, a stick, that's up for what's the most effective approach. But Republicans, I've come from a Republican background, have strongly supported removing regulatory barriers to affordable housing. And the most probably passionate advocate was Secretary of HUD, Jack Kemp, during the administration of George W. Bush. Other ideas, maybe if we're moving to more work around the home, will there be underutilized commercial space that we can try to transition to affordable housing? Are there new technologies and construction techniques that can reduce the cost of building new homes? Do we have skilled laborers who can, do we need more apprenticeship programs so we have a informed and educated home building workforce? So I guess my point, Brian, is that there's a lot of solutions out there that enjoy broad support across party lines. We just need to harness that support and get the focus going and try to move some of this forward.
Yes, and President Trump also issued an executive order on removing some of these barriers to the development of housing as well. So there's a lot to build on, and as you point out, bipartisan support around a lot of solutions, if not every solution. How do we get this going? Do you see anything standing in the way, or once we get off this call, can we start making this happen?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I think everyone should be at the table. Okay, this is an all hands on deck approach. So I think the federal government certainly plays a leadership role, can help act as a catalyst, but a lot happens at the state, county, and city levels where many of the innovations and the problems may exist, but many of the innovations can occur. I think the housing industry obviously has a major stake, and in fact, a major responsibility to move this forward. But I would like to see more of the corporate world writ large getting involved. I think corporations, some of the major ones, are beginning to understand that their workforce needs to have a place to live that's affordable. And I've seen some major corporations make significant investments in affordable housing in the communities where they're headquartered or have major operations. Let's see, maybe that trend will continue. I think the philanthropic sector, academia, of course, have significant and major roles to play. I know at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we have a new Housing Advisory Council trying to raise the profile of the housing affordability issue, and particularly its impact on African Americans and the Hispanic community, the minority community, and because they're the ones who are really disproportionately impacted by how high rental costs and by the inability to access the the home ownership market, particularly for the first time. So I think it's an all hands on deck approach. I mean, at the BPC, we're trying to play our role to encourage this and to act as a catalyst. But let me just say, I don't think this is a this is not an issue that's going to be solved overnight. Okay. So this is like a long-term project. This is like a 10 to 15 year project. If you're looking at the underbuilt number, 5.5 million, it took a long time to get there. So I think it's going to take time to get out. So the one thing I have concern is if we get it together, we need to maintain focus. We need to have people who are in it for the long haul, who are trying to solve this problem. And you know how Washington works. The next issue, it's one issue, you talk about it, then it sort of either something happens or it fades away, and another issue surfaces. We need to keep the focus on this on a sustained basis, because it's going to take a long time to solve the problem or get our hands around it.
I think you're right. And, NAR has proposed some tax-based solutions that may be able to move more investor property to the owner-occupied side of the ledger, but that doesn't ultimately increase the housing stock. But we do think that could have some marginal effects, at least on the first-time home buyer market. But we've also talked about some efforts to convert commercial property to residential and some tax-based solutions there. Any thoughts about that, how tax policy can drive some of this, even in the short term?
Well, again, I mean, tax policy is low-income housing tax credit. Tax policy is the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Yeah, and I think, I know your report mentions tax policy as a tool to encourage the transition of either underutilized or old commercial space to affordable housing. So I'm going to keep my eye on that to see where it's occurring, and maybe state level tax policy, or is being utilized to stimulate that. So I'm going to keep my eye on that going forward to see if there's anything that's going to happen there, and it's going to see if it's working.
Well, I want to thank you for identifying some of the other stakeholders that we need to be sure are at the table here. And I'm glad to see the role that the Bipartisan Policy Center is playing in that. We're going to keep working with you and these other entities to move the discussion forward and to come up with some practical solutions so we can get moving on all of this. Another point that you made, which I want to underscore, is how this pandemic has reinforced to us housing as our stronghold. And so that's another reason why we need to double down on these efforts right now in a bipartisan fashion. So thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for joining us today to share your ideas on this. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to spend a little bit of time with you.
Great. And, Dennis mentioned the role of the states. Next, we are going to hear from a panel of state actors, and my colleague Asa Fleming is going to moderate that discussion. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's check in with Asa.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Asa Fleming, NAR's 2021 Realtor Party Community Engagement Liaison, and I'm pleased to introduce our stellar state panel. Joining us are two Realtor Association experts who will share insights on their efforts to advance housing production, especially of affordable and workforce units. First, we'll hear from Elizabeth Peets. Elizabeth is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Colorado Realtors Association. She has campaigned for 4 visionary housing bills, all of which passed. They include incentives for local governments to build more housing and a pilot program in which renters can report their payments to the credit bureaus. Following Elizabeth, we'll hear from Joe Murray, Government Affairs Director at the Wisconsin Realtors Association. Joe collaborated with several local realtor associations in Wisconsin on a public campaign to tackle the statewide workforce housing shortage. We look forward to hearing from you both. Now I'll turn things over to you, Elizabeth Peets.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Aisha. As you mentioned, I'm with the Colorado Association of Realtors, and we are here today to talk about our Century of Opportunity legislation. Like many of you, we started having a lot of conversations in our neighborhoods and our communities about racial justice and the lack of affordable housing. So what we did was work with our research group and several of our vendors to do some focus groups to find out how we can bring impactful public policy to make the next century of opportunity for all future homeowners accessible to everyone in Colorado. So let's just get into the legislation. Next slide, please. So the first 2 bills are really all about accountability and preparing for the next generation to enter home ownership. The first bill, House Bill 1200, is financial literacy. All of our high school graduating seniors will now have this curriculum requirement so that they can prepare for retirement, understand how to use credit and debit cards, manage the access and opportunity for higher education with student debt, and prepare for home ownership. The second bill, again, all about accountability here. We are now requiring our Division of Housing to annually put out a public report that talks about how we spend our housing dollars, federal, state, or privately donated. We want to know, where are the housing projects taking place in our state? What type of housing are they addressing? Is it rental? Is it home ownership? Is it supportive or rapid rehousing? And then how many units are we creating, preserving, or rehabbing? This data-based approach is going to help us think through how do we strategically use our dollars in the future. And now I want to get to our innovative policy ideas, so you can go to the next slide. First, we're really excited to bring forward House Bill 1134. This is a first in the nation approach. And what we are doing in this bill is taking state dollars to invest in a pilot program that allows landlords and their tenants that opt into the program to build their credit. The way it works is, like homeowners get equity for making their mortgage payments, renters get the ability to build up their credit by regularly reporting the rental payments they're already making. And what's really important to think about is, if you get a better credit rating, it doesn't only prepare you for home ownership and getting a better loan, but it could improve your auto loan, it could improve your cell phone plan. Home ownership is the largest source of wealth building, yet the racial gap is significant in Colorado and many other states between whites and people of color. So this is really important because when we think about our nation, we are going to be much more diverse than the current population count today. So what we're trying to do in this pilot program is figure out how we can support the landlord, housing providers, and the tenants to build better credit. And it really does matter, because when we looked at the research, Blacks and Hispanics have higher rates of credit invisibility, and they have higher debt to income ratios and problems with their credit history. And these are the 2 most common reasons that people get denied for mortgages. For instance, we know that 17% of successful Black loan applicants received higher cost loans, so that they did get a loan, but it cost them more. And the median debt to income ratio for Latino homebuyers in 2018 was 42% higher than the general population. We all know that FHA loans are very helpful, but they're costlier than conventional financing. So if we can improve people's credit through this pilot program, we give them a better leg up to access wealth generation, which is so important. Now I want to talk about our last bill. You can go to the next slide. And this is House Bill 1271. We're super excited about this program. It's going to allocate at nearly $46 million. Part of that is state stimulus funding, and part of it is federal dollars. And we hope at the end of the 3 years of funding that we'll be able to make it a long-standing program. It's really exciting and really dynamic because we worked with our Division of Housing to create the component A and B here you see on the slide, the toolkit program and the planning program. So it works together as 3 coordinated programs. So what you will do is, if you're a local government who is in the beginning phase, you might need to do some stakeholdering in your community to figure out what type of affordable housing needs you may have. And you can work with a consultant to build out that stakeholder outreach. The planning grant is what I call the intermediate grant. So here you are ready to take on your needs assessment and you want to review model land use codes, and you're actually trying to get competitive to apply for a menu grant. And the menu grant is the component that we drove, and we're really psyched about it because it will allow local governments to stretch beyond their capacity to enable them to adopt best practices in affordable housing development and reduce regulatory barriers. We know that many local governments are stretched with their dollars and they want to do more with every single amount, but when they reduce regulations, it costs money. So what we're doing is incentivizing them to take on this ability to stretch and create housing across the state. So let's talk a little bit about what's in the menu. We stakeholdered this all across our state with housing authorities, local governments, and Habitat for Humanity and the other nonprofit developers who create affordable housing. And we said, what could we do to help you guys bring housing forward now? And it falls into about 5 categories: land, permits, zoning, infrastructure and utilities, and parking. So we're excited because this grant program, the menu program, would ask local governments to consider, what are they doing with their vacant property? What are they doing with land donation, land preserving, and land banking? Can you expedite your permitting process? We all know time is money. So if we can expedite the process for affordable housing development or repurposing commercial property, that's a big one post-pandemic, and incentivizing density or density bonus programs that allow us to infill development. Finally, we're looking at how do we reduce and subsidize the costs of infrastructure, whether it's the road to the house or the water or the sewer or the tap fees. If we can actually look at sub-metering, that reduces a lot of costs on the water utility side. We also would love to see local governments look at small square footage residential units, use by right when it meets density or design safety standards. Adding duplexes, triplexes, or accessible dwelling units into single family zoning. And of course, finally, lessening parking requirements for affordable housing development. All of these things we think are going to move the ball and help our local governments meet the demands in our state. So you can go to the last slide. And we're proud to say this, all 4 of these pieces of legislation were passed into law, and we can't wait to get started with the regulatory process to implement them. Also, if you're looking for other ideas, look at the Common Sense Institute report that I've included here as a link. It's really got some innovative federal housing ideas. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Aisha, for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing details about the work you and your team at Colorado Realtors Association did to move forward with the Century of Opportunity initiative. I, for one, have always been in favor, and I do like the idea of allowing renters to claim, to use their rental payments to help them build their credit. And of course, affordable housing, we need that. And I love the idea of affordable housing by right. where, it's just already permitted. And if you're trying to pursue that venture, you can go ahead and do so with not a lot of regulation. So next, we have Joe Murray, who will tell us about the Wisconsin Realtors effort to raise awareness about the statewide workforce housing shortage and lay the groundwork for zoning changes needed to build more residential units. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asa. And Elizabeth, I just wanted to compliment you on your success rate in Colorado. Anytime you can put up 4 bills in one legislature and get them all through, I think you deserve a round of applause for that one, for sure. Thank you for having me here today. And my presentation today is going to be more about a story and a slightly different approach. This was more of a local approach. Instead of going to the state legislature and asking them to pass legislation that would start more from the top down, working with local governments, this approach actually started from the bottom up. But before I get in on the details of that, I want to tell you that what you're looking at right there, the front page of a report that we had commissioned by the UW-Madison Real Estate School. Professor Kurt Paulson is professor of urban and regional planning in Madison. And Wisconsin, like all states, has a very significant workforce housing shortage. I don't think that's any secret. That's going on all over the country. So in order to get this project rolling, we assumed that we were going to need a comprehensive report commissioned by the WRA, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, and go to a very credible source, one that would be widely accepted by the media and state and local lawmakers, councils, etc. So we commissioned Professor Paulson to do the report in 2019. And then we put, the way this looks right now, believe me, when you typically get a report from a professor, it's more like a white paper and it's dry and it's dull. So we had our publications department dress this up and make it a more presentable document. And Professor Paulson identified the 3 real key parts of the campaign that we were going to use inside of this report: the causes for the severe shortage that we have, the consequences as a result, and most importantly, what could be done to address the workforce housing shortage in Wisconsin. So this report was really the foundation of the entire campaign. What we did was we took this report and we took 5 of our local GADs from different regions of the state. And I asked each one of the GADs to find and pick a municipality, their choice, the local board's choice, where the workforce housing shortage was particularly bad, where it was really, really hurting economic development and keeping businesses from growing and those kinds of things, and identify those communities where we could run a grassroots campaign to try and influence local decision makers, county executives, mayors, local officials on the severity of the problem using a grassroots campaign approach. And the report, as I mentioned, was the foundation of it. What we did was we built our campaign around the issues that Professor Paulson identified, and then we really took the points on what could be done and drove it home from a grassroots standpoint. This is where we decided to use NAR's vendors. Next slide, please. Real Strategies, Justin Allen and his team, and they did a wonderful job. I want to give a shout out to Justin and Real Strategies. They did a wonderful job. The campaign they helped us put together included lots of digital advertising, of course, direct mail, and a website that was an NAR website, which is the front page of which you see in front of you, that made it possible to get people, grassroots homeowners and people who are interested in creating and having more workforce housing available activated into the process. So we had 5 local boards identify their territory, their municipality. Each municipality had a $35,000 plus budget. The total budget for this effort was about $205,000. And we took those tactics into those areas and here's the key. I didn't want to write 5 separate grant applications to run essentially the same kind of campaign in each area. So I worked with the NAR staff, and I want to thank them. I asked them if it would be possible to take one grant application and build all 5 of the requests into one, since the campaigns were going to be similar in all 5 areas. And thankfully, they said that that was possible, which really expedited this process front to back. So we identified those communities, we ran the campaign and the tactics on the timelines that were established. And the real objective here, Elizabeth and Colorado were really successful with passing all 4 of their bills, which will make a dramatic difference starting at the state level. What this campaign in Wisconsin was about was working primarily in local communities to try and bring and highlight the severity of the problem for local officials so that they understand how important it is to address the workforce housing shortage. It is a significantly different approach. I think that the Wisconsin example is perhaps one of the best ways to directly confront NIMBY, not in my backyard, because in so many communities, and I think most people know and understand this, the NIMBY issue is a big part and a big reason for the issue that we have. So our approach, we've done a campaign like this a couple of times. This was the first time we did it. We intend to continue this kind of approach, identifying different communities each year to do a similar kind of campaign. I asked the local GADs to identify the places that need the work the most so that we're going into the areas where perhaps we can get the most done and the need is the greatest. So I just can't say enough for the campaign that Real Strategies put together. They helped us identify our targets. They did a great job on creative. I think we used the right tools to try and make our points within each geographic area. And we will be doing this again. It's much easier to take different segments and put it all together in one when you're executing a plan than separate all things out and do it 5 different ways where it's disjointed. I really like the model that NAR allowed us to use, and I would certainly encourage other states and local boards to do the same. And now I will turn it back to Asa. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe. Clearly, Wisconsin Realtors has laid a solid foundation through its Falling Behind campaign to ensure the creation and development of much needed, housing. And I really like the name, the title of the campaign. I mean, it has that, you haven't been staying up to par, but it also raises that and gives that hope that gives and raises the awareness and encourages people to keep, attacking and addressing the issue. So, really love your work. Well, that concludes our presentations. What an information-packed session. Please join me in welcoming and thanking our speakers, Elizabeth Peets and Joe Murray. And thank you for joining this important conversation.